This chapter is over populations, parameters of interest, and sampling frames and samples. So with this in mind, let's try to understand all the concepts within this. When we talk about a population, it is everyone we want to put our results onto. We sometimes call it a population of interest. It's what we want to learn more about. So what they are doing for this problem is they are mailing out a questionnaire to the top 400 profitable companies. They only receive responses back from 4 of them, and they're asking them if they feel that these surveys intrude on their work days. So with this in mind, they are emailing these or mailing them out to the chief financial officers. So that's who they're interested in right here, because that's who they're surveying. So we would assume that. Next, the population parameter of interest is if these surveys do not intrude on their workday. It's a very weird question if you ask me. They're emailing or mailing them a survey to ask them if these surveys intrude on their workday, and that's the parameter of interest, what they want to learn. The parameter of interest is what they want to learn. So it would be the proportion of officers who felt that the survey did not intrude. Now this is where I get a little bit angry at this problem, because when you learn about proportions later on, we'll talk about P, which is the actual proportion itself, and Q, which is the complement, which is the next chapter. So P and Q add up to 1. So the proportion who do not feel it intrudes on their workday would be the complement of the proportion who do feel. So in essence, they are both kind of the same parameter because one is just the complement of the other. But in this instance, we're worried about the people or interested in the people who feel it does not intrude. The sampling frame. Now these are all people who could possibly make it into our survey. The sampling frame are the people we go out and actively survey. That doesn't mean they make it into our sample. So let's look right here. This would be list of, we are sampling the chief financial officers, the CFOs. So it would be the list of CFOs at the top 400 companies. Because we're only sampling the CFOs, and they are everyone who could make it into our sample. Now the sample would be those who actually respond. The sample are the people we have the data for, whatever we have the data for, the actual responses. The sampling method used right here, it's not really random, they're just sending it out to everybody. So it would be questionnaire mailed to all, which is not random, they just went after everybody. The biggest bias right here, think about it. What is it? And it's right here. Just think for a moment. With 4% responding, what's going to be the biggest bias? It's definitely going to be non-response. Maybe these people, I mean, they're making it pretty obvious that if people think it intrudes on their workday, they would not respond to it, and thus we're going to get a problem right here. Going on to the next question. So with this in mind right here, we see researchers wait outside a car dealership they had randomly selected from a list of such establishments. They stopped every 15th person who came out of the dealership and asked whether he or she thought pollution was a serious problem. The population of interest right here, they probably want, and this is a weird question, what they want is to understand all people. That is what a researcher would generally want. I have my qualms with this question because if they're going to wait outside a car dealership, they're definitely getting some undercoverage right here. They're getting only people who go to car dealerships, and I believe this question leads towards that. But the population will be all people because that's who we want to understand. The population parameter of interest is what they think about, let's see here, it's pollution, and if they thought it was a serious problem. And once again, we have the PQ thing that we'll get into in later chapters where the complement of P, which is thinking it's a serious problem, would be Q, thinking it's not a serious problem. And we'll talk more about the complement in the next chapter. The sampling frame would be all the people we could possibly sample. So with this in mind, it would be, let's get in, people who think pollution is a problem. That's wrong. Every 15th person is the sampling method. And we're down between car dealership customers, and all people except those who work at car dealerships. And all people does not work because that means all people would be able to get into our sample, and that's not true. They don't go to car dealerships. Not all people go to car dealerships. I don't know the last time I've been to one. It'd be car dealership customers. The sample is definitely every 15th person leaving the dealership, because we are able to actually get them into our sample unless they give us non-response bias. The sampling method included right here is going to be, pause and wait for it, do you know? Every 15th person, definitely systematic sampling. Definitely systematic. Any potential sources of bias you can detect. In this problem right here, it seems to me it's not that the question's constructed in such a way, response bias, that they're going to put some bias in the response. Non-response, I don't think so. It's that undercoverage. These people are leaving the dealership. And response bias is when you have a change in answer due to question wording, due to the way the person feels about it. It's the are you racist for response bias, where people say, no, I'm not racist. Non-response bias is when they don't respond, and we saw that in the last problem. Undercoverage is when we don't have a specific view in our survey, people who don't go to car dealerships, and they're probably the ones who are more concerned. I'm not saying people who go to car dealerships aren't concerned, but if you think about someone who only bikes to school or to work, they wouldn't go to a car dealership, and they're probably more eco-conscious. So we might think some undercoverage is involved right here. So this is the roller coaster problem right here. And what they are going to do is try to open a new roller coaster. It is popular that people are waiting up to 3 hours for a 2-minute ride. Concerned about how many people might be willing to wait for a 3-hour, assuming, let's talk about this again. Concerned about how many people who might be willing to wait in line for 3 hours feel about this. They survey the first 10 people in line for the roller coaster. So they're serving the first 10 people in line for the roller coaster. And your problem could be very different. So read this one very carefully. This one is the one that changes the most. This is definitely, mine is convenience. If they serve every 10th, every 20th, that would be systematic. If they talk to everybody, that would be a census. If they go out and acquire people randomly throughout the park by, I don't know, generating a random number list and then randomly selecting them, that would be a simple random sample. But the first 10 people, definitely convenient. Is that sample likely to be representative of the people in line for the roller coaster? Heck no. Convenience adds so much bias. That is not a good way to get a representative sample. Choose the sampling frame below. So it would be all the patrons willing to wait in line for the roller coaster. And that is going to be the people we are actually sampling from, because they are at the front of the line. And that's my question. Make sure you're answering yours properly. Mine has all the people who are at the front of the line, so they are willing to wait in line for the roller coaster. Let's see here. This one talks about bias. With bias right here, sometimes a question is worded that it introduces bias. And let's see what we have. Should companies that pollute, well, that sounds like bias to me, the environment be compelled to pay the cost of the cleanup? So the answer is biased towards yes. So we're down between these two. So the word pollute, these companies pollute, it should be, let's see here, a better question maybe, should companies be responsible for any costs of environmental cleanup? You know, that one would have people might say, well, let me think about it. Well, when you say, should companies that pollute be responsible, you're going to bias people towards yes. Always read the second form of the question that they give you and see if it's less bias. Right here, given that 16-year-olds are old enough to drive, is it fair to set the gambling age to 18? So this question is biased towards no. Because I'd say, oh no, since they can drive, they should be able to gamble. I'm not saying I'm thinking that, but that's what they have you going towards. The question is biased towards no because of the preamble, and that sounds good to me. Better question would be, do you think the gambling age should be set to 18? That sounds good to me. So make sure to read the end of each question and see if it sounds a little less biasy. Think about how you would answer the question if you were completely swayed by the way it was worded. I'm not saying you would be swayed by it, but just go over it and think a little bit and be like, does this have any sort of sway in it? Once again, there are some very important things to understand with this chapter that may not have been covered in this video. Things like cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is taking a whole bunch at once, such as taking rows in Neyland Stadium, floors of a dorm. What else? Taking a 12-pack of Coca-Cola. And if you notice, the cluster itself is a random assortment of items. If we go to the student section of Neyland Stadium, we might think that a row would just be a random row of students. Now, I know some students might have preferential, be able to get further up, but let's just say a row is just a random grouping of students. If we go to the Coca-Cola factory and select a 12-pack off the shelf, well, we think that 12-pack might just be a random 12-pack, that if the cans are dented in that one about 5% of the time, well, then they would be dented in other 12-packs 5% of the time, which would be less than one can, but we can ignore that for now. We have also stratified. The big thing to know with stratified is stratified acknowledges differences. When we talk about acknowledging differences, we're talking about colors of M&Ms, flavors of M&Ms. And we oftentimes think of a group when we think of this, but it's not our intent to think about taking a group at once. It's sampling in accordance to the population percentages that those differences persist at. So if we work in an M&M factory and we make 60% regular M&Ms and 40% peanut M&Ms, if we wanted to sample 100 M&Ms, what would we do? We'd sample 60 regular and 40 peanut. That is the idea of stratified. Stratified acknowledges differences: male, female, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, out of state, in state for students. And then we sample in accordance. We could ask people here at UT, do you think UT tuition is fair? Do you think UT is has a fair cost for tuition? I was about to put some bias in the question by saying, do you think UT tuition is too high? So when we ask them about tuition, we might want to do stratified. And by doing this, we might say that 8% is out of state and 92% is in state. So if we sample 200 people, how many out of state will we sample? We stratify. 8% out of state, and think about it, write it down for a second if you have a sheet of paper. 8% out of state, 92% in state, 200 sampled. We would sample 16, because that is in accordance to our population percentages. 16 out of 200 is 8% of 200. So we've covered in this video a little bit of convenience bias, we've covered systematic, we've covered simple random sample. I believe that is pretty much everything. Make sure to go over this. You have your sampling methods, you have the sample versus the population versus the sampling frame in here, and you also have, I believe I have not said yet, bias. You have bias also. Good luck, and make sure to review everything for this chapter, because this homework might not review it all for you.